The history of warfare is a relentless narrative of adaptation, innovation, and grim surprise. The opening chapters of World War II in Europe were characterized by a brutal, grinding deadlock on the Western Front. German military doctrine, forged in the Blitzkrieg's rapid movements, held a deep and almost arrogant reverence for heavy, conventional artillery. Their officers believed they understood the rules of the battlefield, particularly the unmistakable sounds and telltale smoke signatures of an enemy battery preparing to fire. They had been trained to identify the cracking sound of a distant field gun and the telltale whistle of incoming shells from miles away, allowing them precious moments to seek cover or prepare counter-battery fire. This well-established military experience created a dangerous sense of superiority regarding their own heavy weaponry and a dismissive attitude toward the American arsenal. American troops were still finding their footing, and their early equipment often seemed to be a patchwork of conventional designs and repurposed tools. The European theater was a proving ground, unforgiving and swift to punish any nation whose technology or tactics lagged behind. For the German command, the sheer power and range of their own artillery pieces, like the massive 150 mm heavy howitzers, represented the pinnacle of firepower superiority. They viewed the incoming American forces with a mixture of professional respect and condescending skepticism toward their perceived lack of truly heavy, frontline weapons. This tactical overconfidence was a seed that would eventually bloom into a deadly surprise, one that would rewrite their understanding of close-quarters indirect fire support. The American ability to innovate and deploy unexpected technology was about to blindside a seemingly impenetrable German defense. It was a battle not just of men and machines, but of military dogma against practical, silent invention. The established rules of the artillery game were on the verge of being violently, and very quietly, broken forever. The early months were filled with this palpable sense of military superiority from the German side, an assuredness that their intelligence had fully catalogued and understood every threat facing them. Little did they realize, the biggest threat was a weapon that didn't sound like a threat at all, a quiet killer lurking just beyond the tree line. This weapon's silent efficiency would soon turn mockery into pure terror for the German frontline troops. The American strategy was quietly shifting, moving away from predictable conventional fire towards a devastating, unforeseen capability. The landscape of World War II was about to be changed by a weapon initially designed for a completely different kind of warfare. The conventional wisdom that big gun equals loud bang was about to meet its silent, catastrophic end in the muddy fields of the front. The German disdain for certain American weapons, specifically the mortars, was well documented by both prisoner interrogations and captured correspondence. In the eyes of seasoned Wehrmacht officers, American mortars, particularly the lighter, traditional models, were often seen as a poorly executed imitation of their own superior designs. They would often derisively refer to the American mortar fire as merely popgun artillery or dismiss it as nothing more than a nuisance rather than a genuine tactical threat. The telltale thump of a standard mortar leaving its tube was familiar and easily identifiable within the constant din of the battlefield, allowing German soldiers to react with practiced speed. The incoming projectile's whistle was a recognizable sound, affording a short but crucial warning before impact, a sound that became a strange, macabre comfort in its predictability. This complacency was rooted in a military culture that placed immense value on the visual and auditory spectacle of overwhelming power. A large German gun battery would announce its presence with smoke, flash, and a deafening report that often shook the ground for miles around, instilling immediate fear and respect. The American counter, in their initial assessment, seemed comparatively amateurish and underpowered, incapable of truly breaking a well-established defensive line. It was this very arrogance, this failure to consider the possibility of a non-standard weapon, that led directly to their undoing. German forward observers and commanders would frequently radio back reports minimizing the effectiveness of American indirect fire, often boasting about how easily their troops ignored the sporadic explosions. They failed to distinguish one specific American weapon from the general background noise of the battlefield, lumping a revolutionary system in with its much smaller, conventional cousins. This intellectual mistake created a massive blind spot in their defensive planning, making them dangerously vulnerable to a weapon they refused to take seriously. The mocking laughter and condescending reports would soon be replaced by bewildered silence and frantic pleas for reinforcement as the new American mortar began to systematically destroy their entrenched positions. The fundamental principles of artillery fire, range, blast radius, and ease of deployment were all about to be redefined by this unheralded piece of American engineering. Their dismissal of the American mortar stemmed from a historical perspective, where mortars were merely infantry support weapons, not instruments of mass area denial. The German officers' overconfidence was a direct result of their past successes and their unwavering belief in their own tactical superiority over all opposing forces. They had been so successful at war for so long that a genuine paradigm shift in enemy technology seemed impossible to their entrenched military minds. This professional hubris was a costly error in judgment that would eventually cost the lives of entire battalions, turning their early amusement into a deadly, uncomprehending fear of the American front. The weapon that inspired such initial German mockery, and later such profound terror, was the M2 4.2-inch mortar, a system born of necessity and ingenious adaptation. This heavy mortar was the key to the entire strategic shift, possessing characteristics that radically departed from the established norms of contemporary artillery. Its caliber, at 4.2 inches, or 107 millimeters, placed it perfectly between the light mortars and the heavier field artillery pieces, giving it a unique tactical niche. The M2's most distinguishing feature was the combination of its heavy shell and a relatively minimal propellant charge, which resulted in a surprisingly quiet firing signature. Unlike the thunderous roar of the German 105mm and 150mm guns, the M2 often fired with a muffled whoosh or a subdued thud that was extremely difficult to pinpoint amidst the noise of battle. This acoustic stealth made counter-battery fire, the practice of locating and destroying the enemy's guns, nearly impossible for the German artillery teams. They had nothing to target because they could not accurately determine where the fire was originating, a critical advantage for the American gunners. The heavy projectile, weighing nearly 25 pounds, carried a massive payload of conventional high explosive, delivering a devastating blast radius far greater than its sound suggested. This high explosive round meant that its destructive power rivaled some of the smaller, conventional field artillery pieces without any of the telltale noise. It could be deployed quickly, hidden easily, and its mortar trajectory allowed it to drop shells almost vertically onto entrenched positions, hitting targets that conventional, flat trajectory guns could not touch. The lack of a loud muzzle blast also reduced the stress and fatigue on the American crews, allowing them to maintain a higher rate of fire for longer periods. This combination of heavy hitting power, near-silent operation, and high-angle fire gave the American forces an unprecedented ability to surprise and annihilate the enemy. The M2 was often mistaken for a smaller, less potent weapon due to its lack of a spectacular report, deceiving the German observers who relied on sound to gauge threat level. Its deceptive nature made it a truly revolutionary piece of ordnance, a harbinger of modern, precision indirect fire. The entire system was a masterpiece of battlefield contradiction, quiet to fire, yet absolutely devastating upon impact. It was a phantom weapon, the unseen hammer of the infantry, capable of delivering artillery-level destruction right onto the heads of a dug-in enemy. The mortar unit's silence was its armor, allowing them to remain safe while they systematically dismantled the German defensive lines from a distance. The M2 4.2-inch mortar's unusual capability stemmed directly from its initial and entirely different design purpose. It was originally conceived not as a high-explosive delivery system, but as the main chemical mortar of the American Chemical Warfare Service. Its primary role was to deliver large shells containing persistent chemical agents, such as mustard gas, a horrific weapon from the previous World War. This original mission required the shell to be large to carry a substantial payload, but the weapon itself needed to be easily transportable and quickly set up for deployment. The need to minimize the cloud dispersal of chemical agents meant that the propellant charge had to be relatively low to avoid excessively high muzzle velocity. This design choice, intended to ensure the integrity of the chemical payload upon impact, accidentally gave the mortar its acoustic advantage. The low propellant charge meant a low muzzle velocity, which translates to a much quieter whoosh compared to the earth-shaking bang of a high-velocity cannon. When the tide of war shifted and the use of poison gas was eschewed by both sides, the Chemical Warfare Service found itself with a powerful, versatile weapons system in search of a new role. The obvious solution was to rearm the M2 with high-explosive shells, turning its large carrying capacity into a virtue for conventional fire support. The heavy, high-explosive projectile it now fired compensated entirely for the lower velocity, ensuring a tremendous explosion upon impact. This repurposing transformed a weapon of mass chemical destruction into one of the most effective and surprising instruments of conventional area denial in the American arsenal. It became a classic case of military innovation through necessity, demonstrating the versatility of American wartime manufacturing and ingenuity. The German officers who mocked the weapon were not just underestimating its size, they were ignorant of its hidden design legacy, a legacy built on the specialized requirements of chemical warfare. They could not possibly have foreseen that a weapon intended for mustard gas would become the silent killer that decimated their most heavily entrenched battalions. The design quirk of the low-velocity launch, a feature for chemical stability, became the single most important tactical advantage in its new life. This unassuming mortar, carrying its conventional, high-explosive secret, was ready to deliver a shock that would fundamentally alter the balance of power on the front lines. Its double identity, from chemical deterrent to high-explosive hammer, is a unique and often overlooked chapter in the history of American ordnance. For the German frontline troops, the M2 4.2-inch mortar fire introduced an unnerving, psychological dimension to the combat experience. Historically, the process of artillery attack was a clearly defined sensory sequence that provided a form of morbid reassurance. The soldiers expected the loud preparatory bombardment, the long, escalating whine of the shells, and then the explosion, allowing them to mentally and physically prepare. The M2 shattered this expectation, replacing the spectacle of power with a terrifying, inexplicable silence. German soldiers would be subjected to a sudden, violent rain of heavy high-explosive shells without any preceding sign or sound to indicate the imminent danger. The lack of a discernible muzzle report meant that the American gunners were virtually invisible, their positions untouchable by the German counter-battery fire. This absence of an acoustic signature meant that the German artillery teams had no direction to point their guns, turning the methodical practice of counterfire into a desperate game of guessing. It created a pervasive, psychological tension on the front lines, forcing the soldiers to constantly dread the unexpected and completely silent barrage. Entire entrenched platoons would suddenly be annihilated by a tight, accurate grouping of heavy shells without a single warning, leaving survivors bewildered and terrified. The attacks appeared to come from nowhere, delivered by an unseen, ethereal opponent that defied the established rules of engagement. This experience led to a crippling drop in morale, as the German troops felt they could no longer rely on their senses for survival, believing the Americans had developed some form of advanced, silent cannon. The tactical consequence was the complete breakdown of their defensive confidence, as there was no defense against an enemy one could not locate. Their defensive positions, previously considered safe, became death traps where annihilation could arrive instantly and without a whisper. The M2 mortar had turned the battlefield into a place of constant, invisible peril, where security was an illusion and preparation was impossible. The silent delivery was, in effect, a new kind of terror weapon, eroding the will of the German soldier as much as its shell destroyed their physical fortifications. It was an invisible fist, striking out of the clear air, turning the familiar sounds of battle into a deceptive calm before the sudden, catastrophic storm. This psychological warfare component was arguably as effective as the high explosive payload itself, maximizing the impact of every single shell fired. The true genius of the M2 lay not just in its power, but in its ability to inspire a paralyzing fear of the unknown among the disciplined enemy forces. The physical mechanics of the M2 4.2-inch mortar's firing cycle are central to the story of its acoustic stealth and devastating effectiveness. The mortar shell, a heavy, fin-stabilized projectile, was loaded into the tube where it engaged a fixed firing pin at the base, igniting the propellant charge. Crucially, the propellant used was a comparatively small cartridge that generated a much lower peak pressure than a conventional artillery piece of similar destructive power. The resulting muzzle velocity was deliberately low, meaning the shockwave generated at the mouth of the tube, the primary source of sound, was significantly dampened. This minimized flash and sound signature allowed the crews to operate with a high degree of impunity from German observation, a tactical goldmine. The lower velocity also meant that the mortar shell traveled at a high, arcing trajectory, allowing it to bypass terrain and defensive barriers that would halt flat trajectory cannons. The shells descended nearly vertically, making them devastatingly effective against troops dug into trenches, foxholes, and the reverse slopes of hills. The high-angle fire ensured that the shrapnel and blast were contained and focused directly downward, maximizing the damage to personnel and UN-roofed emplacements. This silent, vertical fire was a horrifying realization for the German soldiers who had dug in thinking their positions were secure from direct fire. The sheer weight and volume of the shells that could be delivered in a concentrated barrage, what the Americans called a fire for effect, was truly staggering. American mortar crews could rapidly unleash a torrent of high explosive rounds, covering an area with destruction that was disproportionate to the weapon's auditory profile. The whisper of the launch was followed by the roar of the impact, a jarring contrast that bewildered and traumatized the German troops. This operational efficiency made the mortar the perfect weapon for a sudden, focused assault to clear a path for advancing American infantry. The American ability to mass this silent fire on a single target was the direct consequence of the weapon's unique firing mechanism and shell design. It represents a pinnacle of tactical design where seemingly contradictory requirements, massive payload and minimal sound, were elegantly solved. The M2 was the ultimate tool for delivering surprise and overwhelming force from a position of near-total safety and concealment. The shift from German mockery to genuine alarm was not gradual but rather a sudden, terrifying realization that occurred during major engagements on the front lines. One of the first instances where the M2 mortar's true capability was unleashed saw the systematic, silent destruction of an entire forward German position. The American infantry had been bogged down, unable to advance against a heavily fortified, deep German trench line that seemed impregnable to conventional fire. A concealed M2 battery was tasked with breaking the deadlock, meticulously preparing a highly concentrated fire mission based on precise coordinates. There was no preliminary shelling from the main American artillery, only a sudden, synchronized, and sustained barrage from the silent mortars. German officers in the immediate area were caught completely by surprise, having dismissed the occasional, faint thump as insignificant minor skirmishes. The first shells hit with catastrophic force, precisely centered on the primary trenches and command posts, turning them into instant craters. The speed and accuracy of the barrage were overwhelming, collapsing dugouts and instantly killing the occupants before they even realized a major attack was underway. The most terrifying part for the German survivors was the total lack of warning. One moment, the line was secure, the next, it was dissolving in high explosive blasts. Radio reports from the targeted sector were often cut off mid-sentence, replaced by static and panicked, garbled shouts from the few men who survived the initial wave. The German response was slow and disorganized because their artillery command could not confirm the location of the enemy battery for a counterattack. They were firing blindly into empty space while the American mortars continued their methodical destruction of the enemy lines. When the American infantry finally advanced, they found a scene of total devastation, the German defenses completely broken, their troops either dead or in complete rout. This single, focused display of silent power fundamentally changed the way the German command viewed the battle space and the threat of American indirect fire. The battlefield had instantly transformed from one they controlled and understood to one dominated by an invisible, silent, and deadly menace. The sheer scale of the destruction, entire platoons wiped out in minutes, could no longer be dismissed as minor casualties. This shock-and-awe tactic, delivered silently, began the slow, agonizing process of German military recalculation regarding American mortar capability. The most compelling and chilling outcome of the M2 mortar's deployment was the phenomenon of the vanished battalions, a term that began circulating in the German field reports. These were instances where large, cohesive units holding strong defensive positions would simply cease to exist as a viable fighting force within a few hours. The reports filtering back to German high command were often baffling, describing a massive loss of life and equipment without a clear, identifiable cause of the attack. When follow-up patrols or relief forces reached the decimated sectors, they would find not a protracted battle scene, but a landscape that had been surgically pulverized. The telltale signs were the dense, overlapping clusters of shell craters, all perfectly centered on the German defensive works, a signature of the highly accurate M2 fire. The sheer concentration of high explosives delivered by the silent mortars was enough to collapse tunnels, destroy field hospitals, and bury entire command posts. It was not a scattering of fire, it was a focused, overwhelming hammer blow that delivered the destructive power of a divisional artillery strike onto a battalion-sized target. The low muzzle velocity made the fire immensely accurate over shorter ranges, which allowed the Americans to execute these devastating, precise strikes. The German units were not merely defeated, they were effectively erased, their remaining forces often scattered, shell-shocked, and entirely combat ineffective. This silent, total annihilation had a compound effect, as the disappearance of one battalion would create a massive, unexpected gap in the German line. The neighboring German units would find themselves suddenly exposed, their flanks dangerously open to the advancing American infantry they had previously held at bay. The loss of these large, organized units due to an unseen foe was a massive strategic shock that forced a desperate re-evaluation of the entire Western Front's tactical situation. German officers who had mocked the American popguns were now confronting the horrific reality of their tactical error, an error measured in the complete loss of their fighting men. The mystery of the sudden, silent devastation led to wild rumors among the German troops, further eroding their faith in their own command and defensive capability. The M2 mortar had evolved from a laughingstock to a legend, an instrument of fear that could make large, organized military formations simply vanish without a trace. The sudden, catastrophic losses demanded an immediate and urgent response from the German military intelligence apparatus. Initial reports of massive, localized destruction without heavy artillery preparation were treated with extreme skepticism, often being dismissed as panicked exaggerations from the front. It was only when multiple, high-casualty events were correlated that the German High Command realized they were facing a genuine, novel tactical problem. Field intelligence officers were ordered to recover and analyze fragments of the mysterious ordnance that was causing such devastation to definitively identify the weapon. The recovered shell fragments, being relatively large and uniform, soon confirmed the size of the projectile was 4.2 inches, or 107 millimeters. This size immediately threw off their analysis, as a weapon with this power should have the sound signature of a much larger, and much louder, conventional cannon. Their doctrinal understanding dictated that a shell of that size required a heavy, high-velocity gun, a type of weapon whose presence would be immediately known to their observers. The German intelligence community became mired in a frustrating debate, attempting to reconcile the enormous blast effects with the complete lack of detectable muzzle flash or sound. The prevailing, yet flawed, theories initially ranged from advanced American sound suppression technology to completely misidentifying the caliber of the weapon. They explored the possibility of a new type of rocket artillery or a secret heavy weapon being used for the first time, complicating an already desperate situation. The eventual, painful conclusion was that the weapon was indeed the M2 4.2-inch mortar, a weapon they had previously catalogued and dismissed as being only a minor threat. Their intelligence failure lay not in identifying the weapon, but in fundamentally misunderstanding its operational limitations and the creative ways the American forces were employing it. They had underestimated the destructive payload and entirely failed to account for the tactical advantage provided by its low acoustic signature. The scrambling intelligence effort finally confirmed the horrific reality: the weapon was not a myth or a superweapon, but a known piece of equipment used with devastating, silent effect. This realization led to a cascade of urgent orders, demanding immediate changes to defensive tactics and a desperate search for countermeasures against the invisible barrage. The M2 4.2-inch mortar is often conflated in historical memory with other artillery pieces, particularly the German Nebelwerfer, a potent rocket system nicknamed the Moaning Mini. This conflation is ironic because the M2 mortar was successful precisely due to its lack of a distinctive, terrifying sound signature. The German Nebelwerfer rockets earned their fearsome nickname from the high-pitched, mournful wail they produced in flight, announcing their imminent arrival with a chilling, drawn-out sound. The American mortar, by contrast, provided no such auditory warning, its incoming shell arriving with only a faint, high-frequency hiss or often no audible sound at all until the explosion. The psychological impact of the two weapons was diametrically opposed. The Nebelwerfer used fear of the known, while the M2 used terror of the unknown and the silent surprise. The confusion in historical accounts underscores the novelty of the M2's approach to battlefield acoustics and its tactical invisibility. Its success was its silence, a strategy that inverted the traditional doctrine that equated high power with high noise. The German Nebelwerfer was a weapon of overt terror, designed to break the will of the enemy through its terrifying sound and mass saturation fire. The M2 mortar was a weapon of covert, surgical destruction, designed to annihilate specific targets before the enemy could react. While both weapons were highly effective and feared, the M2's story is a unique lesson in the tactical value of concealment and acoustic suppression in modern warfare. The true German experience with the M2 was not a moaning sound but a deafening, sudden explosion that seemingly erupted from the air itself. The German troops' initial mockery of the American mortar was a misunderstanding of technology. The Nebelwerfer comparison is a historical misattribution of auditory terror. The silent execution of the M2 fire was ultimately more devastating than the terrifying sound of the Nebelwerfer because it offered no chance to escape. The German response to the silent terror of the M2 mortar was a desperate scramble to adapt their long-established defensive tactics. The realization that their entrenched positions were no longer safe led to an immediate and painful shift in how they constructed their forward operating bunkers and trenches. German troops were ordered to begin digging deeper, adding heavy timber and layers of earth to create overhead cover strong enough to withstand the nearly vertical impact of the 4.2-inch shell. They started to place less reliance on the sound of an approaching barrage, instead implementing far more rigorous and exhausting continuous watch and patrol schedules. Forward observation posts, previously a source of tactical information, now became primary targets and had to be constantly relocated and rebuilt under heavy camouflage. The need for deep, reinforced overhead cover dramatically slowed down their construction efforts and diverted vital resources away from offensive operations. The pervasive fear of the unseen attack led to increased instances of combat fatigue and psychological breakdowns among the German frontline troops. Every sudden, faint sound became a source of panic, creating a battlefield of hypervigilance where constant stress wore down the soldiers' resolve. Commanders began to realize that dispersing their forces, rather than concentrating them in strongpoints, offered a better chance of survival, fracturing their traditional defensive strength. They had to fight an unseen enemy, a silent ghost that could strike with the power of a giant and then vanish without leaving a trace of its firing position. The M2 mortar had essentially forced the Germans to fundamentally change the way they fought a defensive war, eliminating their advantage of entrenched position. Their mockery had turned into a profound respect, born of a chilling understanding of the weapon's destructive efficiency. The sheer terror of the M2 became a powerful, invisible ally for the American infantry, softening German resistance before a single soldier had to cross the final open ground. The American mortar was now considered a primary threat, an invisible artillery that commanded the battlefield and dictated the terms of engagement. The M2 4.2-inch mortar concluded its service in World War II with an unparalleled and quiet legacy as one of the war's most effective and deceptive weapons. It demonstrated conclusively that heavy fire does not always require a loud, dramatic report, fundamentally altering the principles of indirect fire support. The success of the M2 set the stage for the development of modern heavy mortars, which continue to play a vital and often unsung role in contemporary military conflicts. Its innovation was not a flash in the pan but a permanent evolution in how infantry-level fire support could be delivered with artillery-level effect. The mortar's operational history became a tactical case study, illustrating the immense value of acoustic stealth and high-angle fire against entrenched opposition. It earned a quiet but intense respect from the American GIs who relied on its massive and accurate firepower to clear the most stubborn German resistance. The stories of the vanished battalions served as a grim reminder to the German General Staff of the costly error of underestimating the American capacity for technological adaptation. The ultimate cost of their early mockery was measured in the lives of thousands of their best fighting men, who were destroyed by the very weapon they deemed a nuisance. The M2 mortar serves as a powerful historical object lesson. In war, arrogance and reliance on outdated doctrine are often more dangerous than the enemy's bullets. The weapon's existence forced a psychological and tactical reckoning upon the German army, one that they struggled to overcome for the remainder of the conflict. It is a testament to the ingenuity of repurposing existing technology to meet a new and unexpected battlefield challenge with devastating efficiency. The M2 mortar, a simple tube on a base plate, remains a symbol of silent power, a key factor in turning the tide of countless small, decisive engagements. Its legacy is not one of booming sound and spectacular muzzle flash, but of the silent, sudden, and total destruction it delivered to the enemy's defensive lines. It stands as a perpetual monument to the effectiveness of quiet innovation over loud, predictable power on the bloody fields of World War II.